Ji-won Kang was a man whose existence was measured in whiskey pours and body counts. His only goal was to keep his empire breathing without letting his own heart do the same. But on a cold, breathless night, at 12 minutes past midnight, a single knock cracked open the silence he had spent 3 years building into a fortress. The woman on the other side of his door was not an assassin. She wasn't a diplomat, a spy, or a rival's emissary. She was something far more dangerous. She was someone who needed him. What Ji-won didn't know, as his hand tightened around the glass of whiskey and his bodyguards moved into position, was that opening that door wasn't just an act of caution. It was the first irreversible step toward everything he had sworn, on the grave of his wife, that he would never allow again. If you're already hooked, you know what to do. Smash that like button, subscribe to Mafia Moonlight Tales so you never miss a chapter, drop a comment and tell us, would you have opened that door? And share this story with someone who lives for this kind of tension. Now, let's go deeper. At 41, Ji-won Kang was the kind of man a room felt before it saw him. He stood at the threshold of his penthouse door the way he stood at the edge of every boardroom, every battlefield, and every grave he'd ordered dug, with the total, weaponized stillness of someone who had long since made peace with the worst versions of himself. He was broad-shouldered and immovable, built less like a businessman and more like a monument to controlled violence. The black suit he wore was tailored to the precise geometry of his frame, its open collar revealing the dark bloom of tattoos that crawled up his neck and chest, ink that told the story of the Seoul underworld in the language only those inside it could read. His face was angular, expressionless, the kind of handsome that comes from years of refusing to soften. His dark eyes, sharp as a scalpel and twice as cold, registered everything and betrayed nothing. In his right hand, as always, was a glass of whiskey. Not his first of the night. Probably not his last. The amber liquid was less a habit and more a ritual, his private tribute to the version of himself that had died alongside his wife, Seo-yeon, 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days ago. Behind him, 2 of his men stood in the golden half-light of the penthouse corridor, motionless as carved stone, the city's glittering nightscape sprawling 40 floors below like a kingdom laid out at his feet. Ji-won Kang wanted exactly 2 things, control of his empire, and the numbness that kept him from feeling the weight of it. He had both. And he had built double-bolted doors, layers of security, and a heart of reinforced silence to make sure nothing, no grief, no desire, no weakness, could find its way back in. He was, by every measure available to him, untouchable. He just didn't know that untouchable things have a way of attracting the one force they're not designed to resist. On the other side of that door stood a woman whose composure, under the circumstances, was nothing short of extraordinary. Amara Osei was 34 years old, and she was the kind of beautiful that doesn't announce itself, it simply exists, self-possessed and unapologetic, even at midnight, even with dried blood on the sleeve of her black-fitted dress and the city's cold rain still damp in her hair. Her long, dark curls fell in loose spirals around her face and shoulders, wild from running but somehow still regal, as if even chaos was reluctant to fully dishevel her. Her skin was deep brown and luminous despite the hour, her eyes alert with an intelligence that had been sharpened not in boardrooms or lecture halls, but in the kind of places where people only call a doctor when they're already out of options. She was a nurse. An extraordinary one. The kind of medical mind that could improvise a field surgery in a bathroom stall and walk out having saved a life. But Amara didn't work in hospitals with gleaming floors and insurance forms. She worked in the shadows of the city, in underground clinics that existed in whispers, serving the people the legitimate system had decided weren't worth saving. She had no visa, no license that any government would recognize, and no safety net. What she had was knowledge, nerve, and hands steadier than most surgeons who'd been trained for a decade. Right now, those hands were raised, not in surrender, but in the practiced, precise gesture of someone trying to communicate something critical before the large, armed man filling the doorframe made a decision they would both regret. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were fierce. And despite every reasonable instinct that should have made her small in that moment, Amara Osei stood her ground on the threshold of the most dangerous man in Seoul and looked him directly in the eye. She hadn't come to beg. She hadn't come to charm him. She had come because she had accidentally saved the wrong man's life, a rival of Ji-won's, and now there were people in the city who wanted her dead before sunrise. She had come because she had run out of every other option, and the math of survival had pointed, with grim precision, at this door. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his empire. She didn't know that the man staring at her across the threshold had sworn, on the most sacred grief he'd ever carried, that he would never let another soul pass the armor. All she knew was that she had maybe 60 seconds to convince him. And Amara Osei had never once failed to make the most of the time she had. The door was open. The city hummed 40 floors below. And somewhere between a man who had chosen numbness and a woman who refused to be erased, a story that neither of them was prepared for was about to begin. He didn't shoot her. That, in itself, was remarkable. Ji-won held the door open for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to clock the blood on her sleeve, the medical bag clutched against her ribs, and the particular quality of her stillness. Not the stillness of someone frozen by fear. The stillness of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome and decided that composure was her best weapon. He stepped aside. She walked in. His men exchanged a glance. He silenced it with one look. She told him everything, standing in the middle of his living room with the city glittering behind her through 40 floors of glass. She told him about the underground clinic on Mapogu, about the men who had been brought in at 10 o'clock with a collapsed lung and no identification. About how she had worked for 2 hours by lamplight to keep him breathing, not knowing who he was, only that he was a human being in front of her, and that was enough. She told him how the man's associates had arrived just as the surgery finished. How they had looked at her the way people look at something that needs to be disposed of. How she had run. His name was Cho Dae-young, she said. Her voice was even. Controlled. But her hands, those extraordinary hands, pressed flat against her thighs, steadying themselves. I think he works for someone called the Red Crane Syndicate. The room shifted in temperature. Ji-won set his whiskey glass down on the side table. Slowly. The way a man sets something down when he needs both hands free to think. Cho Dae-young was not simply a lieutenant of the Red Crane, he was their head of operations. The man whose death Ji-won had been quietly engineering for the better part of 6 months. And this woman, this undocumented ghost of a nurse, had unknowingly walked into the center of that war and pulled Cho Dae-young back from the edge Ji-won had spent half a year pushing him toward. The Red Crane would want her dead not because she knew too much. They would want her dead because loose ends, in their world, were an insult. Ji-won crossed the room to the window and looked out at Seoul. His city. His weight. He could send her away. Hand her a burner phone and a cab fare and let the night absorb her. Clean. Simple. No consequence to him. Except that wasn't true, and he knew it. The moment she had crossed his threshold, the city's surveillance web had registered it. His rivals had eyes on this building around the clock. By morning, they would already know she was here. The decision had already been made. He had made it the second he stepped aside. He turned back to face her. You're not leaving, he said. Not tonight. Not until I say otherwise. Amara Osei looked at him with those steady, unreadable eyes, and nodded once. Not with relief. With the quiet acknowledgement of a woman who understood, perfectly, that she had just traded one kind of danger for another. By morning, the guest room at the far end of the penthouse had been transformed. Ji-won had given the order at 2 a.m. with the same clipped efficiency he used for everything, a few words to the right people, and by dawn a steel cabinet had appeared stocked with surgical supplies, a portable lamp was positioned over a narrow table, and a curtained alcove offered just enough privacy to function as an examination space. It wasn't a hospital. It wasn't even close. But Amara had worked in far worse, and when she stepped into the room and ran her eyes across what had been assembled, she said nothing except, I'll need better suture thread. It was on Ji-won's desk within the hour. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. The first patient arrived that same afternoon, one of Ji-won's men, a heavy-set enforcer named Byung who had taken a blade across the forearm 2 nights earlier and had been quietly bleeding through every bandage change since. He was brought to Amara the way all the men were brought to her over those first days, reluctantly, with their jaws set and their pride visibly wounded at the prospect of being seen to by a woman they hadn't been given the option of refusing. Byung sat in the chair across from her examination table with his arms folded and his eyes on the wall. Amara pulled on a pair of gloves, unwrapped the dressing, and studied the wound with the focused calm of someone reading a page they'd read 100 times before. This is infected, she said. You've been ignoring it. I've been busy, Byung said. She had already begun to clean it. He winced once, then set his teeth and refused to do it again. She stitched the wound in 7 precise passes, applied a dressing, and handed him a small paper sleeve of antibiotics with specific instructions on timing and dosage. Then she stripped her gloves, wrote something in the small notebook she'd asked Ji-won for, and moved on. That was how it went. Quietly. relentlessly. A knife wound on Wednesday. A fractured rib on Thursday, poorly set from a fight 2 weeks prior that the men had simply absorbed and kept moving through. A concussion on Friday that she caught only because she had started watching the way G1's men moved, learning to read the signs they were trained to hide. She began to understand, in those first days, that this was a household built on the architecture of men who had learned to treat pain as irrelevant. They swallowed it. Buried it. Kept moving until something broke beyond the point of hiding. She understood that architecture intimately. She had grown up inside a version of it herself. She said nothing about that either. Not yet. It started with a chair. G1 held his briefings at a long obsidian table in the penthouse's inner room, 12 chairs, 12 men, a strict and unspoken seating order that everyone understood without having been told. Seniority ran from left to right. The chair closest to G1's right hand had been empty for 2 years, since the death of his second-in-command, and no one had presumed to fill it. Amara walked in on the third day to report a medical concern about one of the men, found the only available seat was that chair, and sat in it. The room went absolutely still. She looked around at the assembled faces with the patient expression of someone waiting for a meeting to begin, noticed the quality of the silence, and said, "I can stand if there's a reason for it." No one answered. No one quite knew how. G1, at the head of the table, said nothing. He looked at her for a long moment, that flat, measuring look she was beginning to recognize as his version of close attention, and then returned his eyes to the documents in front of him and continued the briefing as though nothing had happened. The men followed his lead. Reluctantly. Baffled. That was how it went with her. She didn't challenge the hierarchy the way a rival would, with aggression, with posturing, with the careful performance of threat. She simply moved through the penthouse as though the hierarchy were a piece of furniture she hadn't decided yet whether to work around or rearrange. She addressed G1's lieutenants by their first names, which none of them knew how to correct without sounding absurd. She told a senior enforcer named Kwan, directly and without apology, that his diet was accelerating the hypertension she'd caught in his blood work and that he needed to stop eating convenience store ramen at midnight like a university student. Kwan was 53 years old and had once broken a man's jaw with a single closed fist. He started drinking the barley tea she left outside his door without telling anyone he was doing it. G1 watched all of this from his habitual distance. He watched the confusion ripple through his men each time she refused to be diminished, watched them search for a category she fit into and find nothing useful. She wasn't a hostage. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't subordinate in any way they recognized. She occupied the penthouse the way a weather system occupies a landscape, without permission, without apology, and with the quiet suggestion that the landscape had better adjust. He found, to his considerable irritation, that he respected it. He found, to his deeper alarm, that he was beginning to watch for her when she entered a room. He poured a second whiskey. Then he left it untouched. She found it by accident. That much was true. The penthouse had a corridor that the men never used, a narrow passage off the east wing that led to a door with no keypad, no lock, just a handle that turned if you tried it. Amara had been tracing a slow leak in the building's ventilation, tracking a damp smell that she'd identified 3 days earlier as a potential mold risk and mentioned to G1, who had looked at her with the expression of a man who had never once considered that his fortress could have something as mundane as a ventilation problem. She pushed the door open, stepped inside, and stopped. The room was untouched. That was the only word for it. A dressing table with a small oval mirror, a silk robe folded across the back of a chair, a row of perfume bottles arranged by height. Everything preserved beneath a thin layer of dust that made it look less like a room and more like a photograph of one. On the windowsill, a dried sprig of jasmine in a narrow vase, its petals long since gone paper-like and pale but still, somehow, faintly fragrant. Amara stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she stepped back, pulled the door quietly closed, and turned around. G1 was standing at the end of the corridor. She didn't flinch. He didn't move. The silence between them had a different texture than usual, not the loaded, territorial silence of their first days, but something rawer, without armor. "I wasn't," she began. "I know," he said. He looked at the closed door for a moment. Then he looked at the floor. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a man dismantling something dangerous one component at a time, he said, "Her name was Seo-Yun." Amara said nothing. She understood, with the clinical precision of someone who had sat with grief in many forms, that this was not a moment that needed filling. "She kept jasmine in every room," G1 said. She thought it made the air easier to breathe. A pause. She was right. She sounds like someone who noticed things, Amara said quietly. Something moved across his face. Not pain exactly, something older than pain. The settled, permanent weight of a loss that has been carried so long it has changed the shape of the person carrying it. She noticed everything, he said. It was inconvenient. It was the closest thing to tenderness Amara had heard from him. And because she recognized it for what it was, fragile, unintentional, already retreating, she didn't reach for it. She simply nodded, and stepped past him back toward the main corridor. The ventilation runs along the north wall, she said, as she walked. I'll need access tomorrow. Behind her, after a moment, she heard him exhale. It was the first breath she'd heard him take that didn't sound like a decision. It was Byung who found it. He had been monitoring the building's encrypted communication channels as a routine precaution, something Ji-won ordered every 72 hours, the same way other men ordered coffee. What Byung found at 11:17 on a Tuesday night was a 17-second transmission, outbound, routed through 3 relay points in an attempt to look like signal noise. It wasn't. Someone had sent a precise, compressed package of information, Amara's description, her medical background, and the penthouse floor number. Byung brought it to Ji-won without a word of preamble. He set the tablet on the desk, pointed at the transmission timestamp, and stepped back. Ji-won read it once. Then he set the tablet face down on the desk with the same measured calm he used for everything, and the temperature in the room dropped by several degrees. Who? He said. It wasn't a question. Byung had already traced the relay. He said a name, quietly, the way you say the name of someone who is no longer going to be a problem, but whose removal will cost something anyway. Ji-won was quiet for a long moment. The man whose name had just been spoken had worked for him for 6 years. Had sat at his table. Had received, on 2 separate occasions, the kind of loyalty that moves money and coordinates silence and asks nothing in return. 6 years of that, traded for whatever the Red Crane had offered him, and Ji-won had no doubt the offer had been generous, because the Red Crane understood that the most expensive thing you can buy is someone who already has access. He stood. Get her ready to move. 1 bag. 20 minutes. Byung left at a pace that was just short of a run. Ji-won crossed the penthouse to Amara's clinic and pushed the door open without knocking. She was at her narrow table cataloging supplies by the light of the portable lamp, her handwriting small and efficient in the notebook. She looked up at him and read his face in approximately 1 second. How long do I have? She said. 18 minutes now. She capped her pen. Closed the notebook. Began moving. He watched her cross the room with that quality of motion he had catalogued over the past week, precise, economical, nothing wasted. She pulled a small bag from beneath the table, already partially packed, and he understood without needing to ask that she had been ready for this since the night she arrived. She had never, not for a single day, believed that safety was permanent. She had simply chosen not to say so. She paused at the doorway and looked at him. The antibiotics in the top cabinet, Kwon needs the full course. Someone has to make sure he finishes it. Ji-won looked at her. We're fleeing a hit squad and you're worried about Kwon's antibiotics. I'm worried about Kwon's heart, she said simply. The antibiotics are just the current chapter. She walked past him into the corridor. Ji-won stood in the empty clinic for 1 more second, the portable lamp still burning, the notebook closed on the table, the whole room still carrying the faint odor she had brought to it. Then he followed her. They lost the first tail in Mapogu. Ji-won moved through the back corridors of the building with the automatic precision of a man who had mapped every exit long before he ever needed one. Amara stayed half a step behind him, matching his pace without being told to, reading the geography of his movement the way she read a patient, tracking where the tension lived, where the hesitation was. There was none. Not yet. The second tail picked them up 3 blocks east, near the overpass. Ji-won clocked it first, a silver sedan running dark, holding the same distance across 2 turns. He said nothing, only changed direction, pulling them into the lit chaos of a night market that spilled across the street in a tangle of food stalls and music and the thick, sweet smell of grilling meat. The sedan couldn't follow. They kept walking. It was in the narrow service alley behind the market that she noticed it. He was favoring his left side. Barely, the kind of compensation that only registers if you're trained to watch the body for the things it's trying to hide. She caught his arm without breaking stride, pressed 2 fingers between his ribs, and felt him go rigid. How long, she said. It's nothing. How long, G1? The use of his name without title, without distance, stopped him more completely than the question did. He looked at her in the orange half-light of the alley, neon bleeding in from the street, rain just beginning to spot the pavement, and for once did not reach for the composed, armored expression he kept ready for every occasion. Since the second floor, he said. One of them got close in the stairwell. It's a bruise. It's a cracked rib, she said. Maybe two. You're breathing shallow and you've been listing left for 6 minutes. She was already opening the bag. Give me 90 seconds. He looked at her. Looked at the alley entrance. Looked back. We don't have. You can't run a gauntlet across Seoul with a punctured lung, she said, with the same calm she used to tell Kwon about his ramen. 90 seconds. Then we move. He leaned against the wall. Let her work. She bound his ribs with the swift, no-wasted motion efficiency that was entirely hers, strips of compression wrap from the bag, tight and precise, her hands never shaking despite the sound of the city pressing in around them and the very real possibility that the men hunting them were 2 streets away. When she finished, he straightened. Tested the breath. It was better. He looked at her in a way he hadn't allowed himself to look at her before, direct, unguarded, stripped of the careful distance he maintained like a second skin. Thank you, he said. Amara zipped the bag and met his eyes. Don't thank me yet, she said. Thank me when we're somewhere with a door that locks. She moved first this time. He followed. The safe house was in Dongdaemun, a 3rd-floor walk-up above a textile shop that hadn't changed its signage since 1987. 2 rooms, 1 window facing a brick wall, a radiator that worked only when it felt like it. G1 sat on the edge of a narrow cot while Amara unwrapped the compression bind she'd applied in the alley and re-examined his ribs by the light of her phone torch, her movements as steady and deliberate as if they were still in the clinic and not fugitives in a 400-square-foot room with 1 exit. 2 ribs. She'd been right. She taped them properly this time, took his blood pressure with the portable cuff from her bag, checked his pupils out of habit, and then sat back in the wooden chair across from him and looked at him with the expression she'd been holding in reserve for several days now. You knew the traitor, she said. Not a question. Yes. And that's not the first time someone close to you has done something like that. G1 looked at the floor. No. And yet you keep running the same operation, she said. Same table. Same structure. Same willingness to let men get close enough to cost you everything. She paused. You're not protecting your empire, G1. You're daring it to finish what losing Seo-yun started. The name landed in the room like something physical. He looked up at her, and for a moment the controlled blankness cracked along a fault line she'd been watching develop for a week. That's enough, he said, quietly. No, Amara said. It isn't. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and held his gaze with the particular steadiness of a woman who had sat beside enough suffering to know exactly when softness was cruelty in disguise. I've watched you for 10 days, she said. You eat like you're fueling a machine. You sleep maybe 4 hours. You take risks your own men flinch at because somewhere underneath all of that control, you've decided that surviving isn't the same thing as being alive. And you've made your peace with that. She let the silence sit for a moment. That's not grief. That's a slow way of choosing to die. And calling it loyalty to her memory doesn't make it brave. It makes it a coward's way out. The radiator ticked. Somewhere below, the city moved on, indifferent. G1 was quiet for so long that Amara thought he might simply shut the wall back down and leave the words unanswered the way he left whiskey glasses, present, conspicuous, untouched. Then he said, what if I don't know how to be anything else? It wasn't a deflection. It wasn't armor. It was, she understood with a quiet certainty, the truest thing he had said since she knocked on his door. She exhaled slowly. Then you learn, she said. Same as everything else. She handed him a glass of water, not whiskey, and he took it without comment. Outside, the city hummed its relentless hum. Inside the room, something that had been locked for 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days shifted, not open, not yet, but no longer entirely closed. They came at 4 in the morning, which was when they always came. Amara heard it first, not a sound exactly, but the particular absence of one. The alley below the window had been generating a steady ambient noise all night, the distant traffic, the textile shop's loose shutter rattling in the wind. When both stopped simultaneously, she was already sitting up in the dark. G1. He was awake before she finished saying it. 3 seconds later he was on his feet, and she understood from the way he moved, fluid, immediate, no transition between sleep and readiness, that this was a man who had spent years never fully going under. Always listening. Always half deployed. He looked at her. Bathroom. Lock it. Don't open it for anyone who doesn't say your name first. There are 4 of them, she said. I can hear 2 on the stairs and 2 in the alley. Your ribs, Amara, are going to make left side defense almost impossible, so lead right. She held his gaze. I'm telling you, not arguing with you. Something moved through his expression, too fast to name, too visible to ignore. He took the information, nodded once, and moved toward the door. What happened in the next 4 minutes she experienced in fragments through the locked bathroom door: impact, then silence, then impact again, each pause between them worse than the sound itself. She sat on the cold tile floor with her bag open and her hands in her lap, steady, because panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford and had long since stopped reaching for. Then silence. Absolute and total. Then her name, through the door, in his voice. She unlocked it. He was standing in the narrow corridor, breathing hard, favoring his right side now as well as his left. There was a cut above his eye that was bleeding efficiently and a stillness to the apartment beyond him that told her everything she needed to know about the 4 men on the stairs and in the alley. She brought him to the cot without a word and began. The cut was deep but clean, 7 stitches, which she placed with the lamp balanced on the windowsill and his jaw set against the sting of antiseptic. She worked in silence for a while. Then she said, "You could have run down the fire escape. Left me in the bathroom and created a diversion." G1 said nothing. "You didn't even consider it," she said. "Not an accusation. An observation." "No," he said. "I didn't." The needle moved. The lamp held steady. Outside, the city was beginning its slow turn toward gray dawn, the darkness not lifting yet but thinning, the way it does just before the light decides to commit. She tied off the last stitch and sat back and looked at him, at this man who had spent 3 years in love with the idea of his own ending, and saw, for the first time, that the idea had lost its hold. He was looking back at her the same way. "How do the ribs feel?" she asked. "Like 2 cracked ribs," he said. "Good," she said. "That means you're paying attention." He returned to the penthouse on a Thursday, which was an ordinary day for everything else and an extraordinary one for this. His men were assembled at the obsidian table when he walked in, all of them, the full 12, because the summons had carried a particular weight that none of them had misread. G1 stood at the head of the table and looked at each face in turn with the slow, total attention of a man who has spent years learning to read what people hide beneath their stillness. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, it was quietly, and it was final, and by the end of it 2 men had been removed from the room by Byung and would not be returning to it. The silence that followed was the clean kind. The kind that comes after something necessary. Then G1 said, "There will be a change in how this organization operates." He let the words settle before he continued. "We have been running on the assumption that strength means the absence of vulnerability. That model has cost us more than it has protected us. It ends now." No one spoke. No one had been invited to. "Amara Osei will serve as my chief medical officer and operational advisor. She has full access and full authority within her domain. Anyone who cannot extend her the same professional respect they extend to me can follow the 2 men who just left." He looked around the table one final time. "Are there questions?" There were none. Amara, standing at the far end of the room where G1 had asked her to wait, said nothing. She looked at the assembled faces, at Byung, who gave her a single small nod, at Kwon, who was looking at the table but whose jaw had unclenched, at the others, recalibrating in real time, and understood that this was not a ceremony. It was a restructuring. And restructuring, she knew from years of working in broken systems, was only meaningful if the architecture beneath it had genuinely shifted. She believed, for the first time, that it had. That evening, after the men had dispersed and the penthouse had settled into its quieter rhythm, she heard G1 in the East Wing corridor. She did not follow. But 20 minutes later he appeared in the doorway of the main room, and she looked up from the supply list she was revising, and she saw it immediately, the thing that was different about him. He was not carrying anything. He had gone into that room with 3 years of preserved grief sitting on a windowsill, and he had come out with empty hands and something in his face that was not yet peace but was its outermost edge, the first breath of open air after a very long time underground. He sat down across from her at the table. She slid the supply list aside. "I kept the jasmine," he said. "The dried sprig. I just moved it." "Where?" she asked. "My room," he said simply. "Where it belongs. With me. Not as a shrine, just as something I'm not ready to put down yet." Amara looked at him for a moment. "That's not letting go," she said. "That's carrying it differently." "Yes," he said. "I know." Outside, Seoul moved through its ordinary Thursday evening, indifferent and luminous. Inside, two people sat across from each other at a cleared table and, for the first time, neither of them was bracing for what came next. It was Amara who asked to see them first. Not the wound above his eye, already healing cleanly beneath her careful stitching. Not the taped ribs or the bruising along his shoulder that he'd absorbed in the safe house and not mentioned until she found it herself. She meant the older ones, the silver-white lines on his forearms that predated her by years, the kind of scars that don't come from a single event but from a long-sustained accumulation of a life lived in the direction of danger. They were sitting at the cleared table, 2 cups of barley tea between them. Quan had left a box of it outside the clinic door that morning without a note, which was its own kind of language, and the question came out of a quiet that had become, over the past weeks, genuinely comfortable rather than merely armored. Ji-won looked at her for a moment. Then he rolled up his sleeve. She studied the scars the way she studied everything, without pity, without drama, with the full and steady attention of someone for whom a body's history is simply information to be understood rather than evidence to be judged. She didn't touch them. She didn't need to. "Every one of these healed," she said. "Obviously," he said. "I mean it as a fact, not a comfort." She looked up at him. "The body doesn't negotiate with damage. It doesn't decide a wound is too significant to repair. It just begins. Quietly. Without asking permission." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "People are the same. The grief starts healing the moment it arrives, whether we cooperate with it or not. What we get to choose is whether we help it along or spend our energy keeping it exactly where it is." Ji-won was quiet for a moment. "I chose the second one." "For 3 years," she said. "Yes." "And you," he said. "You've been carrying something too. Since before my door." It was the first time he had turned that quality of attention directly back on her, and she felt the full weight of it, this man who read rooms the way she read bodies, finally reading her. She didn't deflect. She had told him, weeks ago, that staying closed was the coward's way. She was not a hypocrite. "I left home at 19, she said. "I've been undocumented in 4 countries. I've treated people that polite society decided weren't worth saving, and I've done it in rooms with no windows and no guarantee that tomorrow would be available." She paused. "I kept moving because I thought motion was the same thing as being okay." A beat. "It isn't." "No," he said softly. "It isn't." Outside the window, Seoul was doing what Seoul always did, sprawling and bright and relentlessly, almost aggressively alive, as though the city itself had decided that standing still was a form of surrender. Ji-won reached across the table and turned his arm over, the old scars facing upward, visible and unguarded. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the quietest possible version of what it was, a man showing someone his damage and trusting them not to flinch. Amara placed her hand over his wrist. Not clinically. Not as a nurse. Simply as herself, as the woman who had knocked on his door at midnight with blood on her sleeve and fire in her eyes and no idea that she was walking toward the thing that would finally make her stop running. "Integrity," she said after a while, "doesn't mean being unbroken. It means being honest about where the breaks are. And being brave enough to let something new grow in the space they leave." Ji-won looked at their hands on the table. At the scars beneath her palm. At the particular, unrepeatable shape of 2 damaged people choosing, with full knowledge of the cost, to stop treating survival as the ceiling. "That's a high standard," he said. "Yes," Amara said. "It is." She didn't move her hand. He didn't move his arm. The tea cooled between them. The city hummed. The jasmine, somewhere down the corridor, held the faint ghost of its scent in the room where it had always lived, and Ji-won Kang, for the first time in 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days, was not counting. He swore he'd never love again. She wasn't trying to change his mind. She was just the only person brave enough to sit with him in the dark until he remembered that he already knew how.